Starting from LCS, follow the traffic on Main Street. Make an easy left.
Just thinking of the World Wide Web and its pointers, every human being has these spaghetti things going out to every other computer and human being, and there's this gigantic, massive spaghetti spanning the entire globe. And if you want to find out something, how do you find it out?
The bits are moving around so fast that hardly anyone has thought to preserve them, to archive them. And the way the technology is changing hasn't helped us either. You know, a piece of paper sticks around for 500 years, and by golly, it's legible to human eyes. So it's not likely that human eyes are going to change in another 500 years. But of course, disks and memory and data formats change every couple of years.
As the huge and vastly growing human record, all the data that we as mankind are accumulating is growing so rapidly. Who has time, who has the energy, who has the resources to keep looking back and seeing if old information, still useful, is being transformed to the new media before the old media are essentially unusable?
We're voyaging into brave new worlds, digital worlds.
Go to the future.
Electronically recording, gathering, creating, and connecting a universe of information and knowledge, and making it available at our fingertips. But the sheer quantity of digitized information and the dynamics of an evolving computerized world create complex problems. One of the most serious is that we pay little attention to preserving electronic writings for the long term, to making sure that important and irreplaceable work will be saved and be available not just for our own use, but for generations to follow. What's increasingly at risk is the survival into the future of recorded knowledge, the survival of collective memory, the core of civilization, the human record. August 25th, 1992, Sarajevo. In the war for Bosnia-Herzegovina, in an act of hatred calculated to destroy collective memory and erase the culture and identity of a people, gunners targeted with hundreds of incendiary rockets the National Library. Tens of thousands of rare Islamic texts, unique 16th century manuscripts, important works of Bosnian, Croat, and Serb writers and poets, 3 million volumes, the irreplaceable history of a people, consumed in flames, even as exhausted citizens joined hands to save what they could of the soul of their city. Catastrophe has always loomed as a threat to portions of the human record, through fires and floods, earthquakes and wars, and also in the past 100 years through the slower fires of acid in the paper of printed materials. Much of the history of civilization has been damaged or destroyed. But it's not only the physical survival of recorded information that's crucial to preservation. The ability to decipher and comprehend its meaning is essential as well. For over 1,000 years, scholars tried but lacked the knowledge to interpret Egyptian hieroglyphics. Though perfectly preserved through millennia, their meaning had been lost in time. In London's British Museum, intricately carved, is a 4-foot-long black stone, over 2,000 years old. Discovered in the sands of Egypt in 1799, it is the fabled Rosetta Stone. The information the stone records is unexceptional. except for the remarkable circumstance that identical text is presented in 3 languages: hieroglyphics, demotics, and finally, readily comprehended Greek. The Rosetta Stone was the key to deciphering and understanding the writings of an entire ancient civilization. Stone has long given way to paper, and today paper is fast giving way to new means of recording and accessing knowledge.
Last Opsis 6. Do you copy my last?
The communications complex at Goldstone in California's Mojave Desert. The huge antennas are part of NASA's deep space network, able to receive and process digital electronic signals from unmanned spacecraft millions of miles away. Since 1958, NASA space probes have been generating vast quantities of data.
Give me a call. We're unable to assign a couple of these nets.
Space missions studying the Earth's environment have generated even greater amounts of data. Information regarding ozone depletion, global warming, the growth of deserts, and other potential threats to life on the planet. Acquired at enormous cost, much of this priceless information, stored on magnetic tape, is in jeopardy.
20 years ago or more, the projects were so focused on building the spacecraft and getting the fundamental technology proven and getting to the first visit of the planets that people really didn't look at saving the data for when the mission was over. For example, Viking, that went to Mars. The key part of the mission was around 1976. Well, this is 20 years later. Those tapes are decomposing. Now, that was a heavily investigated planet and mission, and a lot of people were familiar with the data, but now enough time has passed. Many of the people have retired, or it's not easy to access the tapes, and it becomes much more important to have them in an archive form.
Historically, magnetic tapes, which was the main storage media used until just 4 or 5 years ago, you can take one out of the box, record it, and then try to read it and have an error on it. That's how bad it is. And some of the conversion efforts that we've done over the last few years, we're finding 10 or 20% of the tapes have errors on them. So magnetic tape is just a disaster for an archival storage media.
The problem with preservation is one which archivists and librarians think about because that's their business. But unfortunately, computer science as a field has not had very much interest in this problem. I'm not sure that it isn't aware of it, but it has a mindset that says, you know, we are in the business of charging ahead into the future and dropping the past behind us and not carrying the baggage of old, obsolete systems. People are more interested in what's the new paradigm, how are we going to create new, more exciting hypermedia with new capabilities that have never existed. But those new capabilities, those paradigm shifts, leave old documents stranded in the past with no bridge to the future.
Washington, D.C., the National Archives. Over 200 years of the official records of the nation, including the founding documents. There are miles and miles of shelving containing every type of government record. Treaties, letters, patents, maps, architectural drawings. 3 billion pieces of paper. The information infrastructure of the nation. Everything determined by the archivist to be of enduring value. There are also millions of microfilms, photographic negatives, motion picture films, phonograph records, and video and audio recordings on various formats. Now, machine-readable materials are by law included as well. It's anticipated that by the year 2000, fully 75% of all federal transactions will be handled electronically. Flowing into the Archives Center for Electronic Records in Maryland are over 800 digital data streams, vital statistics on health and welfare, surveys on crime, data on population and housing, and from every government agency, torrents of email communications. The amount of archived electronic materials is doubling every year.
You can't have a democracy if the government is not accountable to people. And one of the ultimate ways that this government is accountable to people is by maintaining records of what the government did, what it said its policies were, and therefore enabling the people to figure out whether the government acted in accordance with policy and law. Traditionally, we, like basically all the archives in the world that deal with electronic records, ask the originators to send it to us in a form that's not dependent on any specific hardware or software, because we have to presume that most of our customers, who haven't been born yet, are going to want this information at a time when all of the technology used to generate it has disappeared from the marketplace.
A highway in New York. Every day, hundreds of hazardous waste shipments, each authorized by a permit, crisscross the state on their way to one of 1,000 different disposal sites. The Center for Electronic Records in Albany manages more than 1,000 huge databases. The hazardous waste permitting system is just one, but a very important one. There are certain kinds of information, increasingly created in electronic form, that for society to survive are going to have to be accessible for a very long time. Knowing where we've deposited poisons, radioactive materials, and hazardous wastes is one of them. Through the state's computerized geographic information system, waste sites can be located and studied in relation to freshwater wetlands and centers of population. The operation is critical to future generations to avoid repeating such costly tragedies as the Love Canal. This is one small example of the kind of information which must be preserved forever, faithfully replicated in each new digital technology standard as it comes along. It's an obligatory, one-way monologue with the future.
We have to have experts that understand systems and how to migrate them. We have to have routines in place for migrating information from one form to another. And those kinds of organizational issues need to be put in place and routinized so that they are part of the cultural fabric, not something new that we have to fret about. They have to be ordinary events in our daily lives. And it's moving from a period where we don't understand all the pieces that have to be put in place and their interrelationships to a point where we are naturally dealing with digital information and moving it forward as interest requires. That is the major cultural change and the nub of the problem that we're really facing here.
Amid the stored records and archives of states and municipalities, businesses and institutions are the train wrecks of the information age. Important digital information which can no longer be read. In Oregon, the primary national database for people with disabilities vanished. In New York, the corporate records of the Pennsylvania Railroad erased. In several large states, irreplaceable data on land use indecipherable because of missing software. The losses, though immense, are silent and invisible. We're aware of them only when it's too late.
Whether records survive or not depends on whether we as a society think it's important to see that they survive. And one of the differences between digital preservation and preserving traditional formats of records is that digital records don't just survive by accident. We have to make a conscious decision that they're worth keeping. We have to think about that when we create them in the first place in terms of the standards that we use. We have to really make a commitment to keeping them alive in a way that we haven't had to in the past. That's not to say that we haven't dealt with fragile materials, but we would run across things by accident that had been stored in an attic or a basement, and 50 years later or 100 years later still be able to read and retrieve and understand them. That won't be the case with digital records unless we make some kinds of conscious plans and have regular vigilance over them.
At the American Library Association annual convention, publishers who've been reinventing and redefining the concept of publishing gather to show off their digital wares.
Keep exit to log into Arabic Windows.
What I can now do is say I want to go to, oops, where'd it go?
Search full text, we call level 1, or we can customize our search, and we call that level 2.
And we have the African American experience, the American Revolution, the Civil War, Westward Expansion.
With the advent of electronic books and digital networks, librarians are increasingly concerned that there not be created information haves and have-nots. New York's Science, Industry, and Business Library counts itself part of the solution.
Few families in New York have the means to have internet access at home. So, for those who don't, this is our attempt to level the playing field. You could get off the airplane at Kennedy from Zambia, take a taxi in to the Science, Industry, and Business Library. No one will ask you for a piece of identification, for a library card, for a fee, but you just walk in the door, sit yourself at a computer, get on the internet, pull down a database, do whatever you wish for free.
One of the things that concerns me most is that there's such an enthusiasm for putting information into digital form. Many libraries are rushing into digital projects, and sometimes at the expense of their preservation microfilming projects. And the worst nightmare I can imagine is that all of the money that had been going into preserving books in the traditional way, microfilming or conservation projects, will be diverted to providing access to digital information without making any provisions for preserving it, so that money is being drained from the traditional preservation projects and nothing is being done about preserving the new digital information. And then we'd lose twice.
A lot of the new material that's getting created artistically and in a scholarly sense is being created electronically to begin with. It doesn't exist on paper, doesn't get published in magazines anymore, only gets published on the web or published in electronic form of some sort. And so we're in danger of losing all of that if we don't solve this problem.
The New York home of the Voyager Company, a leading producer and publisher of electronic books. Here, the creative possibilities of digitization are very exciting and immediate, while future preservation and access issues are a more distant concern.
What you'll be able to do is access a movie, which would be through this mirror. There'll be a timeline, a map of where Dracula exists.
What I'm working on is called Witness to the Future. It's a CD about environmental activism. What I have to do before I give everything to my programmer is make sure all the content is correct and everything's laid out, so all the graphics are fixed and everything.
I can't imagine that anything that we are making today will be available 100 years from now. I don't even think it'll be available 25 years from now. In fact, a lot of stuff that we made 7 or 8 years ago can't be played. I mean, there are two problems. One is the durability of the media itself, and the other is the machines that they play on. And nobody really knows how long the media will last, although our indications are that entropy takes over fairly quickly, and these things have a tendency to degrade much faster than anybody, at least in the companies that makes them, is willing to predict. And the second problem, though, is that the machines go out of style. And nobody bothers at the time to sort of make a translation program. And if you go out 100 years from now, the possibility that somebody will, have remembered to make a machine that runs Microsoft Windows 2.2, it's impossible. It won't happen.
Each of the media seems to be racing the others towards obsolescence as fast as it can. And in a sense, that's because they're each trying to improve as fast as they can. And so the new versions come faster and faster, and new versions make the old versions obsolete and unreadable. So it's a natural process, but it's one that we have to recognize is not helpful from a preservation point of view.
We get stuff that's 3 years old now, outdated. We pick up scrap computers from many companies in this valley. National Semiconductor, LSI Logic, Cypress Semiconductor. I mean, the list goes on, but I don't want to mention my customers. I have competition.
That's a good chip.
I estimate about $300 million for this load of mainframes is what they paid for them. And they're outdated in 8 years.
Computers were created essentially to service giant organizations, and they were tended by a sort of a priesthood of technicians. But once computers went from being something that exclusively belonged to large organizations to something that served and belonged to individuals, a tremendous amount of translation, psychological and sociological translation needed to be done. What I did was translate some of the ideas that belonged to the priesthood of technicians and made it accessible and usable to civilians, to ordinary people.
As more and more information is stored electronically, we are increasingly vulnerable at any time to catastrophic loss.
I have a PowerBook, the 5300, and it was supposed to be the latest, newest model, and apparently it had some problems in its development, and the logic board cracked, and shortly thereafter I lost my hard drive and everything, my world.
When computers crash, all is not always lost. There are professionals who specialize in recovery, in breathing life back into fragile, intricate disk drives, just long enough to coax off and capture the data.
Crash is where the drive doesn't work anymore. A crash can be a multiple of different things, though. A crash can be where the hit actually makes contact and starts scraping off the medium that's on the platter that holds the data. That's the disk right there. That's the metal that the data is saved to. Now we're going to show you where we are magnifying onto each track. See these lines? There's sectors where data is kept, like a filing cabinet. It's kept in a particular spot. The data is stored in between these marks, and everyone has an address or an identification. If the data is all scraped off or gone, there's nothing we can do. But if there's something on that in that device that we can get to, we get to it within about a 95% ratio.
From cafes and offices to homes, libraries, and schools, people are rushing to embrace not only computers, but also the network of networks connecting it all, the World Wide Web, a technology of which it's been said, the only thing it changes is everything.
People go online. They play with aspects of themselves. They express pieces of themselves that they're not always aware that were even there. It's like Cyrano de Bergerac finding in the virtual reality of writing something about himself, a capacity for love and passion that he didn't even know was there. People are discovering that online.
It's a great place to be. Playing with this website.
We're talking about fundamental infrastructural changes in our society with this new electronic technology. So it's not any one particular application and so on. It is just a fundamental new kind of wiring for our society. Like 100 years ago, we put in the electricity system. We put in the telephone system and so on. Those completely transformed how we lived. Today, we're moving into that same kind of almost punctuated evolution to the infrastructure, having now to do with things like the World Wide Web that absolutely transform our ability to connect to others, our ability to basically view all the information in the world in one kind of homogeneous type of access structure and form.
It was a combination of the web, the browsers, and the underlying internet that existed for 15 years, which created what we now see as the web browser phenomenon that everyone is using. There's so much talk today about technology leading to unemployment and causing difficulty that I think we forget that technology is humanity's child. We have created it. To love it is to love ourselves. And second, it does help us.
The web was the creation of a young British scientist, Tim Berners-Lee. Now, as director of the consortium controlling the web, he works from his office at MIT to try to guide its future. A future which, by redefining what we mean by documents, has greatly complicated the obligation to preserve.
If you remember the world before the World Wide Web, it was a question of getting information from one place to another by tracking down a group of experts who could log on to the right computer, find out how to extract the information from the relevant program, how to put it onto a floppy disk, then how to read the floppy disk on your own computer, then what to do with the data when you've got it. All this was a question of conversion and incompatibility, and the world was full of incompatibility. It was incompatible because a lot of the formats were proprietary formats owned by one manufacturer to which another manufacturer would not commit. So in order to get the interoperability, you have to have open standards. That was the way I saw it. The web is an open, universal medium like paper. The web itself doesn't constrain what information you put on it. You've got to expect all kinds of information. There's some indecent material out there. There is advertising material out there. There's material from hate groups, which you wouldn't want anybody to read. There is information you really sympathize with, and there's some beautiful stuff out there. So the commercialization of it, its use in advertising, for example, its use for trade, is all part of the world, and it's very important that a universal medium should accept all types of information.
The whole concept of linked nonlinear documents makes preservation very tricky, because where do you draw the boundary around a document? If my document references 16 other documents by having links to them, then what does it mean to preserve my document? Do we also have to preserve all of those other 16 documents and transitively all of the documents that they reference and point to? And you can think of the web as one huge interlinked connection of documents. You could think of it as a single document if you wanted to. It's not quite where we are at the moment, but it's a reasonable model. And if you do that, then what does it mean to preserve that? How do you even describe what you've got? And it's dynamic, it's changing every moment. People are adding things to it, modifying things to it. So we just don't have the understanding yet, the conceptual understanding of what we're doing and where it's going that would enable us to make sensible decisions or choices about preservation.
Information highway, electronic publishing, I think will sound in 20 years like horseless carriage sounds to us now, because they're all analogies to something that's an old technology, to highways, to libraries. And I think this technology really changes everything. It changes the way we communicate. And we basically need a new language to describe these new relationships and the new styles of seeing and teaching and learning. If you begin from thinking about it as a communications medium, then the social policies have to concern free speech, have to concern education, have to concern public access. So it's the narrow focus on transportation of commodities on an information highway that I think limits our field way too much.
One of my favorite examples of longevity is a wonderful line from one of the Shakespeare sonnets. And in fact, this is a photograph from the Folger Library of their 1609 quarto edition of the sonnets. That was when the sonnets were first published, so nearly 400 years ago. And the 18th sonnet, which is one of the most famous, which begins, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" ends with the couplet, "So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." And what I love about that is that the "this" in the couplet is the sonnet itself. It's a poem that's referring to itself as a work of literature. And the inference is that he knew, or guessed, that this thing that he was writing under his hand as the ink came out would last forever. Well, it's only been 400 years, but I would say there's a fair chance that if anything lasts, the Shakespearean sonnets will. We need to do something equivalent for digital information. We have, at the moment, a very poor chance that a current Shakespeare writing deathless prose, deathless poetry at the moment will see their lines last for anything like the next 400 years.
And this gives life to thee. It is the human record, caught at this point in time between the world of print and the new and demanding world of electrons and photons, that gives civilization its life. Somehow the substance of that record must continue to be preserved.